The Atlantic slave trade was outlawed by both the United States and Britain by 1808. But it continued illegally in some U.S. ports, and internally, slavery held its grip on America. The domestic slave trade prospered, and it helped to spread slavery into the territories. For 180 years on American soil, masters and human traffickers had produced more slaves by several means, and had sold them for profit. This continued until the Civil War. Northern states were not free either. They embraced gradual emancipation, a process in which formerly enslaved people found themselves bound to their masters as indentured servants. In that context, anti-slavery activity intensified across the North from 1808 forward. About that same time, Chautauqua County was formed in an extreme southwestern corner of New York State. It had been the former home of the extinct Erie people, and then home to the Seneca people, who are part of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. Yet, in 1797, Treaty of Big Tree had removed the Seneca people to reservations. The 1797 map indicated lands reserved by the Indians according to the treaty made with them. Then, in 1802, those two reservations along Lake Erie, at today's Dunkirk, New York, and North Evans, New York, were ceded by another treaty, which traded most of the Seneca people's Lake Erie frontage for more land along the Cattaraugus Creek. The Holland Land Company's 1804 map showed the change, which remains today. The name Cattaraugus is an anglicized version of the Seneca people's phrase for the stream. The now missing reservation in Dunkirk had been near today's Canadaway Creek, which is another name derived from the Seneca people's phrase for the stream. The Holland Land Company's 1804 map labeled this creek as the Cascade. The 1804 map also showed two major Seneca trails, but instead called them the Erie Road and the Pennsylvania Road. The first 1804 road led northeasterly from New York's westerly border through today's Westfield, New York, then across the Cascade near today's Fredonia, New York, and then on to Sunset Bay, New York. The Erie Road followed parts of today's Webster Road and parts of today's Route 20. The second Seneca Trail, labeled as Pennsylvania Road, now opening, led from today's Sunset Bay to the Seneca lands at today's Salamanca on the Allegheny River. It followed today's Allegheny Road through the 19th century settlements of Nashville, New York, Cottage, New York, Cattaraugus, New York, and Little Valley, New York. A short distance southeast of today's Sunset Bay in New York's Cattaraugus County, Holland Land Company settlers built mills on the Cattaraugus Creek in a former Seneca fishing village on the edge of the Cattaraugus territory of the Seneca Nation. This was a segment of the creek that was still part of New York State on both banks. The settlement of Versailles, New York, then became a major source of trade between Holland Land Company settlers and the Seneca people, and a major source of information regarding the Underground Railroad. Located on another former Seneca trail, today's Versailles Road runs northeasterly through the Seneca territory toward Buffalo, New York. Eber Pettit, a native of central New York, participated in a patent medicine business and lived with his family and his daughter's family in a large Greek Revival home in Versailles. Just after the Civil War, Pettit detailed his involvement in the Underground Railroad. In serialized chapters for a Fredonia newspaper, Pettit wrote about his role as an Underground Railroad conductor through Ohio and as a station master here in Versailles. He correctly explained that the system was neither underground nor a railroad. Instead, he alluded to facts accepted today, that the first word meant a secret resistance, and that the second word was a trendy phrase for moving people fast. But Pettit's stories, later published as a book, are difficult to read. He is considered a primary source, but among researchers, Pettit is seen as an enigma. Due to faulty memory, as well as romanticized embellishment, his stories do not always add up, either geographically nor chronologically. Additionally, even though he professed love and respect for the refugees in his care, his published narrative was egregiously condescending toward his African American visitors and colleagues, including Frederick Douglass, to whom he dedicated the book with a backhanded compliment. Pettit was similarly dismissive toward his wife and daughter until much later, when he dedicated a window to them at the Fredonia Baptist Church. They had operated his station for weeks and months at a time, while Pettit himself was on the road, transporting refugees and selling the herbal remedies of his family business. Toward the Seneca people, Pettit was respectful, but he was an early participant in the Thomas Indian School near his home. He worked paternalistically to convert the Seneca people to his own religion. Although Pettit betrayed the promise he had made to his first newspaper article not to name his Underground Railroad assistants, those he did mention can be reasonably verified as to time and place. Pettit expressed deep gratitude for them, including another station master he called Friend Andrew, who was most likely Andrew Varney in the Quaker community of Pontiac, New York, just north of the Seneca people. Using Pettit's verifiable information, it is possible to extract the kernels of truth from his stories. Some paths to his station came northwesterly through Cattaraugus County, New York, and some backtracked southwesterly through Erie County, New York, and the Seneca Nation. Several others can be traced to 3 overlapping areas of Chautauqua County. One ranged from Corry, Pennsylvania, to the Lake Erie shore. Another stretched from Warren, Pennsylvania, to the Lake Erie shore. The third contained overlapping trails between the hills along the Erie Road and the shoreline of Lake Erie. More than 1,100 anti-slavery people have been documented within or connected to those 3 trail systems.
Pettit indicated that Underground Railroad operatives typically used 6 major categories to identify themselves and the formerly enslaved persons they assisted. Under such railroad terminology, a passenger was a refugee seeking freedom. A station master operated a safe house. A conductor escorted passengers from station to station. An agent facilitated correspondence among conductors, and a stockholder supported the anti-slavery enterprise either financially, politically, or both. A detective was a person who not only tracked bounty hunters, but who also alerted conductors and station masters of the urgent need to move a refugee by an alternate route. In Chautauqua County, Pettit and other sources point to all 6 categories of operation within each of 3 overlapping Freedom Trail systems. Those overlapping systems were 3 sub-networks of the Lake Erie trunk line across the Niagara Frontier section of the overall Underground Railroad system. Those 3 overlapping systems were also the northerly sections of trunk lines through Ohio and Pennsylvania. The trunk lines were mapped many years after the Civil War by Ohio State University professor Wilbur H. Siebert from his own extensive research. Acknowledged by Siebert, but not shown on his map for reasons of space and scale, was a spiderweb of trail systems, also called laterals, feeding the trunk lines. The Corry, Pennsylvania to Lake Erie Trail system fell within that spiderweb. It was part of a larger network that stretched southerly into today's West Virginia. It covered western Chautauqua County, but on its eastern edge, it overlapped with the Warren, Pennsylvania and Lake Erie Trail system in the following areas: from Sugar Grove, Pennsylvania, through the town of Bustye, through the city of Jamestown, and through Chautauqua Lake. On its northerly edge, the Corry Lake Erie Trail system overlapped with the Lake Erie Shoreline Trunk system. As white settlers were moving into Chautauqua County between 1804 and 1830, some brought indentured servants, and a few people of African American or Native American descent were already here. By the early 1850s, there were 140 people who were listed as free color on the Chautauqua County map. 82% of them lived within the Corry Lake Erie Trail system at that time. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1793, signed by President Washington, had cemented a slaveholder's constitutional right to capture escapees. People who assisted refugees could be fined. The law was sometimes used as a ruse to kidnap any African American, but here in Chautauqua County, refugees and their protectors felt relatively safe. That was partially due to consistent rulings by the Missouri Supreme Court, which yielded protection for refugees in free states. Furthermore, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in 1842 that free states were not required to assist the capture of escapees. Therefore, between 1836 and 1850, the first 14 years of Chautauqua County's most active period of the Underground Railroad, there seemed no great urgency for refugees to leave the county. That comfort level changed suddenly. In 1851, 7 young men who had escaped slavery were living at various Underground Railroad stations in and near Chautauqua County's town of Bustye. As 5 of them continued to work and socialize within the community, a well-meaning abolitionist returned to Virginia with 2 of those men in an attempt to buy the freedom of their enslaved wives. The 2 refugees, who are as yet unidentified, and their white benefactor, whose name has been speculated, were captured in Virginia and were reportedly beaten until they revealed the location of the other 5 escapees. On an early autumn morning, a carriage of men disguised as women pulled into the William Storm farm in Bustye and apprehended one of those 5, Harrison Williams, sometimes known as William Harrison. Harrison Williams' captors sped him to Buffalo, in spite of pursuit by Storm's neighbors and in spite of an alert sent from Jamestown's new telegraph system to Dunkirk's new telegraph system near the Lake Erie shore. Following a hasty trial in Buffalo, Harrison Williams was returned to slavery. The previous year, at the urging of slaveholders, President Millard Fillmore had signed a new version of the fugitive slave law penalizing officials in any state who did not assist in the capture of escapees from slavery. The new law also generated jail time and steeper fines for those providing food and shelter to refugees. Accounts of the Harrison Williams case appeared in Jamestown and Buffalo newspapers, and the story was also picked up by the New York Tribune. Published accounts in later years indicated that the other 4 refugees, who are as yet unidentified, had been quickly hidden in Jamestown's R.P. Marvin Swamp and then escorted northwesterly to eventual safety in Canada. Abolitionists in Chautauqua County were incensed by Harris Williams' capture, which became locally known as a kidnapping. This county's anti-slavery sentiment increased, and the sheriff who had assisted the bounty hunters was defeated in the next election. Not far from Jamestown's Marvin Swamp was a small community that white Jamestonians called Little Africa. There lived Catherine Harris, originally from Meadville, Pennsylvania, who described herself as a station master in Chautauqua County. Her interview appeared in the Jamestown Evening Journal in 1902, a half-century after the Harrison Williams capture. Harris was of African descent, as were most of her immediate neighbors. She said that she walked the muddy city streets to earn her living as a housekeeper and as a washerwoman. Her obituary later reported that she had also served as a governess for the prominent R.P. Marvin family of Jamestown. Harris said that refugees might stay in Jamestown for a while, but felt compelled to move often. She reported that prior to universal emancipation, persons of color were treated like property. She referred to President Abraham Lincoln as a great and noble man. Harris was a founder of Jamestown's African Methodist Episcopal Church. She said that among Jamestown's white abolitionists, there was one in particular who brought refugees to her home for food and shelter and then picked them up the next day or soon thereafter. He was Silas Sherman, a well-known Baptist. Bronze statues of both Harris and Sherman now stand in Dow Park near the former Harris home site. Congregationalists, Wesleyans, many Presbyterians, some Methodists and Episcopalians, and most Baptists are on record as anti-slavery persons in Chautauqua County. Many stockholders in the underground system belonged to the Harmony Baptist Association, which included several congregations within the Corey Lakeshore Freedom Trail system. Those groups of Baptists were located in the Chautauqua County settlements of Asheville, Bustye, Carroll, Clymer, DeWittville, French Creek, Harmony, Jamestown, Mayville, Mina, North Harmony, Ripley, Sherman, Westfield, and West Portland. The same Baptist Association also included the following congregations in nearby northwestern Pennsylvania: Greenfield, Harbor Creek, Lottsville, Northeast, Oakville, Pine Grove, Warren, and Waynesville. This group of Baptists published their support for the anti-slavery cause. For example, in 1842, their printed summary of their annual meeting quoted a statement that they had unanimously adopted. It said, "Resolved that we look upon slavery as a great moral evil, and do most affectionately beseech our brethren to put away this sin for their own good and the good of the oppressed." Further evidence of stockholders in the Corey Lakeshore Trail system is found in the papers of Judge E.T. Foote of Jamestown, who was later identified by his son Horace as a local agent for the underground. Judge Foote made copies of the signatures on 3 petitions to Congress signed by his Jamestown neighbors in the early 1840s. Each petition addressed a specific request for some kind of legislation that would help the abolitionist cause. Several of Chautauqua County's anti-slavery petitions exist in the National Archives. One of those, in the Corey Lakeshore Trail system, came from the town of Sherman, New York, in the early 1850s. It said, We, the undersigned citizens of this town, do hereby respectfully petition your honorable body for the repeal or radical amendment of the Fugitive Slave Law passed at the last session of Congress, and adduce the following as our reasons for such a course. We believe that law to be unjust in its action, contrary to the spirit of our Constitution, radically opposed to the feelings of humanity, totally contradictory to those eternal principles of justice which are far above all merely human law, and lastly, in bold defiance of the express commands of the eternal God, we therefore, without distinction of party, would hereby add our might to the protest in tones louder than the thunder of Niagara.
Like its counterpart to the west, the Warren, Pennsylvania to Lake Erie Trail system fell within the Lake Shore Trunk Line's spiderweb of laterals. Evidence of its overlap with Chautauqua County's other trails systems is found in the early 1840s correspondence of Jamestown's Judge Foote. In his surviving anti-slavery papers is a list of individuals who his son Horace later identified as probable Underground Railroad conductors or station masters. Many of their locations fall within the Warren-Lake Erie Trail system and are corroborated by further evidence of anti-slavery activity in their respective communities. Like the Harmony Baptist Association on the westerly side of Chautauqua Lake, the Erie Baptist Association on the easterly side of Chautauqua Lake published their annual meeting reports. Those meetings were held in one of the association's churches. The Erie Baptist Association routinely adopted anti-slavery statements, such as this one from their meeting in 1848. Resolved that we deeply deplore the connection of any portion of the Christian world, and especially the Baptist denomination, with the sin of slavery, and we recommend to the ministers and churches composing this body that they labor for its extinction. In another statement, this time from 1852 in Nashville in Hanover, New York, the Erie Baptist Association said, "Indeed, Africa's oppressed sons and daughters stretch forth their manacled hands in eloquent pleadings for liberty and the bread of life." Also like their counterparts on the westerly side of Chautauqua Lake, people even in the most remote settlements of the Warren-Lake Erie Trail system signed anti-slavery petitions. And so it was in and around Nashville and Hanover, New York. The little settlement was a stop for cattle drovers on the 1804 Pennsylvania Road, the former Seneca Road leading from Sunset Bay to Salamanca. The Baptist church here was the first in the town of Hanover, a town which ultimately had 3 more Baptist churches within a few miles. Petitions survive from the men and women living around the Nashville church. Addressed to the Senate and House of Representatives of the United States about 1844, the women's petition read, in part, "The undersigned females of Hanover, Chautauqua County, State of New York, respectfully pray your honorable body promptly to reject the annexation of Texas to this Union. For this, among other reasons, while we do not claim for Congress the power to abolish slavery in the several states, we are opposed to its further extension by that body, and hence are decidedly hostile to the annexation of Texas to the Union with a constitution which expressly sanctions slavery and encourages the slave trade." A matching petition from the men also survives, and it contains identical language, except that it describes its signatories as legal voters, in comparison to the females of the women's petition, highlighting the disenfranchisement of American women. The actions of the Ladies' Anti-Slavery Society of Ellington, New York, further exemplify Chautauqua County's women's contributions to the Underground Railroad in western New York. Beginning in the mid-1850s, directly defying the Fugitive Slave Law, They collected items of clothing and bedding for local refugees. Additionally, they mailed similar items to an Underground Railroad agent in Syracuse, New York. But then they had a visit from William Wells Brown, who had escaped slavery in Missouri about 1840. He was a writer whose freedom was officially purchased by a British couple many years after his escape. On his ensuing lecture circuit through Chautauqua County, he encouraged the Ellington ladies to send crates of goodwill items to William Still's Underground Railroad station in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Still's parents had escaped slavery from Maryland, and he devoted his young adult life to the Underground, working with the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society's Philadelphia branch from 1847 forward. There, he secretly kept records of those who passed through his station, hoping that his documentation would later help reunite scattered family members. Back in Ellington, Melvina Brooks' husband, educated at Oberlin, was following in the footsteps of two other Ellington physicians, who had corresponded on anti-slavery issues with Judge Foote. Melvina Brooks was the president of the Ladies' Anti-Slavery Society, and on Wells' advice, she corresponded with Still in the late 1850s. According to Still's records, at least one shipment from the Ellington ladies was valued at $56, or over $2,100 today. The crate contained, among other items, 13 pairs of socks, 13 men's shirts, 7 pairs of pants, 4 capes, and 8 bed quilts. In his 1846 published papers, Still expressed gratitude for such stockholders in the Underground Railroad. Back in Chautauqua County, near another small settlement in the hills above the Lake Erie Plains, lived Underground Railroad station master Benjamin Franklin Vincent, whose role in the enterprise was identified 90 years later, in 1939, by his granddaughters Anne Elvira Vincent and Coral Vincent. That September, Benjamin Vincent's reveal appeared on the front page of the Fredonia Censor newspaper. Anne and Coral had submitted a list that their grandfather had labeled Inventory of Articles Designed for the Fugitive Slaves in Canada and by whom contributed. The newspaper printed it in full. Most of the people listed had been the 1850 neighbors of Benjamin Vincent and his wife, Elvira Searle. The total value of the items was estimated by Vincent to be about $65, or over $2,400 today. Vincent himself donated a quilt, an axe, and a set of false teeth. Near the Benjamin Vincent farm was the small community of Omar, New York, now called Hamlet. There, James and Charles Mark, father and son, made their fortune in the production of potash, created by leaching the ashes of the burned hardwoods that had been cleared to make farmland in this part of Chautauqua County. James and Charles Mark were acknowledged on Vincent's list for donations valued at nearly $5, about $190 today. Charles Mark much later donated 2 elaborate water fountains to the village parks in downtown Fredonia. Also near Vincent's Underground Railroad station were Judge Foote's contacts, Russell O. Smith and Dr. Austin Pierce. Judge Foote recorded this about them in 1845. I think they are Baptists and decided abolitionists. Dr. Pierce was also on Vincent's list for donated items worth $1 or $38 today. He served in the New York State Assembly with 2 other abolitionists from Chautauqua County, Emory Force Warren of Fredonia and Rossiter Preston Johnson of Westfield, who later became mayor of Sacramento, California. Dr. Pierce and his wife are buried in Omar. Their daughter Julia married Charles Mark and is buried in Fredonia. Russell O. Smith, a blacksmith, and his wife Abigail Mathewson founded the Free Will Baptist Church in Omar. Judge Foote's records include Russell O. Smith on the list of Liberty Friends, individuals that Foote's son Horace later identified as his father's Underground Railroad contacts. In the early 1840s, Russell O. Smith had invited Judge Foote to speak on the subject of universal freedom. In his letter to Foote, Smith said, "Mr. Chaplin at Leona thought you would come here to Villanova. It seems the reasons are more urgent that someone should deliver a liberty address soon in this town and in the towns of Cherry Creek and Arkwright, at the Arkwright Center near Simeon Clinton's farm at Cherry Creek Corners." Today known as Center Road and Meadows Road in the town of Arkwright, in Smith's time, these routes and their intersection were part of a shortcut between Cherry Creek and Leona. Simeon Clinton was also on Judge Foote's list of Underground Railroad contacts. The Mr. Chaplin, who was visiting the area, was the nationally known abolitionist William L. Chaplin. Also, Simeon Clinton and many of his neighbors at the Arkwright Center had sent the following petition to Congress in 1844. The undersigned citizens and electors of the state of New York, residing in Arkwright, in the county of Chautauqua, respectfully pray that no state be hereinafter admitted into the Union unless the Constitution of such state shall expressly prohibit the existence of slavery within its limits. On the edge of the Warren Lake Erie Trail system, William Shattuck of Randolph, New York, sent a letter to Judge Foote in the early 1840s, inviting him to speak at the Little Baptist Church in Leon, New York, at the behest of yet another Underground Railroad contact, Bliss Willoughby. Shattuck wrote, "Elder Willoughby informed me this morning that some of the Leon inhabitants are moving toward liberty and would like to meet with you." Eber Pettit described Leon as part of a sublateral running from Warren through Jamestown, then through Ellington and Leon, and then passing through Pettit Station in Versailles en route to Friend Andrew in Pontiac, New York, and on to cross the Niagara River to Canada from Black Rock, New York in today's Buffalo.
Extensions of the Lake Erie trunk line stretch from Cleveland, Ohio to Niagara County, New York. Eber Pettit stated Friend Andrew usually delivered his passengers to Black Rock and Buffalo. Pettit also had family and acquaintances who could deliver refugees to crossings in Lewiston, Youngstown, or Niagara Falls. A refugee being escorted by land might be led to a lakeshore port to evade bounty hunters. The reverse was also true. If bounty hunters were on the lakeshore, a refugee might be led backward into the hills and then northerly toward the Niagara River. Refugees who had found their way into Chautauqua County had usually come from Tennessee or Virginia through the trunk lines and laterals in eastern Ohio or in western Pennsylvania. Pettit's African American colleagues in the Underground Railroad gave lectures along the lakeshore trunk line. One of them was Jermaine Wesley Logan in Syracuse, New York. He had escaped from slavery in Davison County, Tennessee, around 1834. Logan was also the son-in-law of William Storm, whose Chautauqua County farm near the state line was the site of Harrison Williams' capture. As an elder in the African Methodist Episcopal Church, Logan was also a visitor to Catherine Harris in Jamestown. Logan was later connected to Rochester, New York, since it was his daughter Amelia who married the Civil War veteran Lewis Henry Douglas, who was the son of Frederick Douglass. Logan and Frederick Douglass both attended the 1854 Anti-Slavery Convention in Sugar Grove, near William Storm's farm. 9 years later, Hardy County, Virginia, where Harrison Williams had been enslaved before he escaped and took refuge at the Storms farm, became one of the 50 counties that joined the Union as the Free State of West Virginia. Between 1836 and 1863, scores of the underground routes led to the Lake Erie shore. Pettit's father and mother, Dr. James Pettit and Lucy Felt, operated a station on the edge of Fredonia. In that village, the library and museum are still named for their grandson-in-law, Darwin R. Barker, the husband of Helen Pettit. The Pettits had moved to Chautauqua County by 1836, along with their church friends and in-laws, the Sweets. James and Lucy's son, Eber, married Uretta Sweet. Eber's niece, Mercy Delvin, married David Sweet. They and other family members were all active in the Underground Railroad in some capacity. In 1836, they also transferred their church membership from Delphi, New York, to the Fredonia Baptist Congregation, where they recruited many more anti-slavery operatives. Also, James soon became the president of the Chautauqua County Anti-Slavery Society. When James died a decade later, his station was operated by his wife Lucy, his daughter Harriet, and his son Melancton. The shoreline network stretched well into the hills above the Lake Erie Plain. By 1840, soon after Eber Pettit had established his station in Versailles, he corresponded regularly with Judge Foote in Jamestown. They both knew and admired Reverend Samuel Ringgold Ward, another speaker who was in demand on the abolition circuit. Ward and his parents escaped enslavement in Maryland's eastern shore when he was a small child. He would become a congregational minister. During his 1845 speaking tour in Chautauqua County, Reverend Ward wrote to Judge Foote, insisting that anti-slavery churchmen should remember to vote according to their convictions and to campaign for abolitionists. Reverend Ward was such a popular speaker that when he visited a schoolhouse in northwestern Chautauqua County, his host, Only Nichols, wrote to Judge Foote that Brother Ward did great good here. I wish Brother Ward could be obtained to speak here before the town meeting. The East Ripley Presbyterian Church was located near the Only Nichols farm in an anti-slavery neighborhood where the Wyoming County abolitionist Andrew Young later used Judge Foote's complete historical records to write a thorough history of Chautauqua County's first 6 decades. Also, near the East Ripley Presbyterian Church were the Wattlesburg Baptist Church and another Baptist church just across the state line in Pennsylvania. Both of those little churches took part in the annual meetings of the Harmony Baptist Association when anti-slavery resolutions were adopted by unanimous vote. Even higher in the hills above Lake Erie, Jonathan Sackett Nichols, another Nichols family member, wrote to Judge Foote in 1844, urging the judge to give an anti-slavery speech in the southerly portions of the towns of Ripley and Westfield. 24 more friendly faces were ready to greet refugees in and around Westfield, including Reverend Albino Hall, who was a Wesleyan minister. He also corresponded with Judge Foote on anti-slavery matters. Reverend Hall was from a large family that came to Chautauqua County from St. Lawrence County, New York, and spread out across the Lake Erie Plain. Another Westfield correspondent with Judge Foote was Deacon Hiram Couch, a founding member of the Presbyterian Church in Westfield. Couch and his fellow church friend Eber Stone operated a woolen mill there. Another Judge Foote correspondent and a probable station master was Thomas Danforth. He lived on the outskirts of Westfield. He was the vice president of the Chautauqua County Anti-Slavery Society in 1839 when Dr. James Pettit was the president. Between Westfield and the Salem Crossroads, which is today's Brockton, New York, Reverend Jonathan Wilson Jr. had organized the West Portland Baptist Church, which also took part in the annual anti-slavery resolutions. Several more of Judge Foote's anti-slavery correspondents resided between Lake Erie and the original Erie Road and the hills above Salem Crossroads. Many in the area signed an 1845 petition to Congress that had been circulated by James Thompson. Thompson's petition sought to abolish slavery in the District of Columbia and to prevent the addition of many more slave states to the Union and to abolish the capture of free persons. Among those who signed Thompson's petition were the Baptist James Hall and his father Ahira Hall, who were the brother and father of Reverend Albina Hall, the Wesleyan minister back near Westfield. Today's library in Brockton, New York, is named for the father Ahira Hall. Along the Lake Erie shore, west of today's Dunkirk, New York, were even more anti-slavery families connected through the marriage of both Ahira Hall and to Dr. James Pettit. Between the Lake Erie shore and the hills of Arkwright, New York, were at least 300 more anti-slavery persons. Also, James and Lucy Pettit's daughter, Alnora Delvin, was married to an attorney near the Lake Erie shore in Dunkirk, who had contacts about possible steamers that could carry refugees from Dunkirk across Lake Erie to Fort Meldon, Ontario, on the Detroit River. Pettit described two confirmed steamship operators on Lake Erie, Captain Thomas Jefferson Titus, now buried in Buffalo, New York, and Captain Hiram Chapman, now buried in Versailles, New York. Their destination was usually Detroit, but they stopped for fuel in Fort Meldon, Ontario, also known as Amherstburg in Canada West, where refugees could safely disembark. The Amherstburg Freedom Museum is there today. Although it was extremely risky to travel as stowaways, this was an alternative for some refugees who would have faced bounty hunters on the Niagara River. Herbert Pettit and Judge Foote both confirmed that the Dunkirk banker Truman Coleman loaned money to assist the refugee Joseph Norton in the purchase of the freedom for his wife and child. They had been thrown into prison in Maryland after Joseph Norton escaped. With the loan, William L. Chaplin then secured their release, and Norton spoke in Chautauqua County schoolhouses and churches in order to raise enough money to repay Coleman. In various places on early stagecoach routes, there were hotels and livery stables where bounty hunters could be easily detected when they changed horses. One of the hotels was in Leona, near yet another anti-slavery Baptist church. An even larger hotel was in Forestville, near another anti-slavery Baptist church. In Gowanda, New York, the stagecoach road split. One option was to travel toward Herbert Pettit's brother, James Jacob Pettit. He was an attorney in Perry, New York, who had drafted and circulated many petitions to Congress. On another road, high above Leona and Forestville, Pettit identified John Little as a conductor. He was an African American who operated a farm and a butcher shop near the Town Family Hotel, known as Chicken Tavern, and not far from all the anti-slavery people at Cherry Creek Corners.
The Chautauqua County hills surrounding John Little, Simeon Clinton, and the Chicken Tavern Hotel provided the major crossroads between the Warren to Lake Erie Trail system and the Lake Shore Trunk Line. A few miles below, on the Lake Erie Plain, there were two more Little Baptist churches in the Erie Baptist Association. They were on a direct line between Dr. James Pettit in Fredonia and his son Eber Pettit in Versailles. Next to the Baptist Church in Sheridan, New York, was the farm of John Ezekiel Griswold. Judge Foote described him as another promoter of anti-slavery reading material, which suggests that he most likely circulated another petition, which has not survived. In 1827, Griswold and his anti-slavery neighbors, Haven Brigham and Nathaniel Gray, had successfully lobbied the New York State Capitol in Albany to create the town of Sheridan in Chautauqua County. Griswold then operated the South Sheridan Post Office from his home. The other Little Baptist church was in Hanover Center. It was connected to Eber Pettit's anti-slavery colleague, Reverend Alonzo Frink. In 1844, Reverend Frink's brother-in-law, Nathan Mixer, who was a member of the New York State Legislature, wrote to Judge Foote, urging the judge to continue telling people that they could only eliminate slavery by means of the ballot box. One cold day in Hanover Center, Reverend Frink intercepted a bounty hunter who was tracking a refugee who was in Pettit's care just down the road in Versailles. Without seriously bending the truth, Reverend Frink turned the bounty hunter backward toward Fredonia, while Pettit safely conducted the refugee forward toward Canada. As for the actual above-ground railroad, both Eber Pettit and William Still said that refugees occasionally took the enormous risk of train travel. Pettit described an Underground Railroad agent at the Buffalo and State Line Railroad Depot in Silver Creek, New York. The agent, who has not been identified, was someone who could hide a refugee for a brief period.